The day my aunt slid that folded piece of paper across the kitchen table, I thought it was a grocery list, and for a few seconds, that mistake felt like mercy. The paper rested between us, right next to the chipped sugar bowl, its edges perfectly aligned with the table as if even paper needed discipline in this house. The kettle was still warm behind me, humming faintly, and the smell of over-steeped tea clung to the air. The clock above the refrigerator ticked louder than it ever had, each second tapping against my ribs. "Read it," my Aunt Miriam said, and she didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes stayed on the sink, on a mug she had already washed once and was washing again, slow circles, steady hands. Miriam always did things twice, once to do them and once to make sure they were done right. I unfolded the paper, my eyes moving down the page as my breath thinned with each word. Utilities, split evenly. Groceries, monthly contribution. Room rent, effective next month. At the bottom, written in her careful, slanted handwriting, "You're an adult now, this is only fair." My childhood bedroom had just been priced. People say, "At least you had someone to take you in," and they say it kindly, with good intentions, as if the story ends there. My mother died when I was 11. Cancer doesn't rush, it lingers, hollowing out a house long before it empties a body. My father tried, but grief swallowed him whole. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed. Some nights he forgot to come home. Eventually, he forgot how to be a parent. That's when Miriam stepped in, my mother's older sister, unmarried, no children of her own, known in the family for being responsible and dependable. When she took me in, everyone applauded her generosity. At church, women squeezed her hands and whispered that God saw her sacrifice. At family gatherings, people pointed at me and said, "That's Miriam's girl. She raised her." Miriam always smiled at that, tight, contained, proud, and I smiled too. I believed the story. Her house was modest but immaculate, beige walls that never changed, floral couch covers that smelled faintly of lemon polish, shoes lined neatly by the door and always facing the same direction. A framed Bible verse hung in the hallway, slightly crooked because she believed humility meant not fixing things that weren't necessary. I learned early what necessary meant. Dishes were done immediately after meals, laundry folded into exact thirds, towels stacked by size and not by color. If I did something wrong, Miriam didn't yell, she sighed, slowly and deeply, as if disappointment weighed more than anger. That sigh followed me through childhood. But she packed my lunches, sat in the front row at school plays, clapping politely, never too loudly, and waited up when I worked late, sitting in the living room with the lamp on, pretending she hadn't been watching the clock. She wasn't cruel, she was precise, and I mistook that for love. As a child, I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought it meant giving up the couch so I could have a bed, buying me school shoes before replacing her worn ones, telling people she was fine when they asked if raising someone else's child was hard. I didn't know then that love could keep quiet records. When I turned 18, nothing changed on the surface, but underneath something shifted. Miriam began talking about money more often, not directly, just small comments slipped into conversation like loose threads. "Food costs more these days. Electricity isn't cheap. I raised you like my own." I nodded, agreed, thanked her, and learned to feel guilty for existing. When I got my first full-time job after college, she hugged me longer than usual, her cheek pressed against my shoulder, the smell of rosewater and starch rising between us. "You can help out more now," she said softly. I wanted to. I started buying groceries without being asked, paid the internet bill, slipped cash into her purse sometimes, pretending I'd borrowed it and forgotten to return it. She never said thank you. The expectations simply grew. The first time she mentioned rent, it sounded almost casual. She said people my age usually pay rent, eyes on the television. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, and told her this wasn't people's houses, this was home. She didn't laugh back. Home still costs money, she said, and something cracked then, not loudly, just enough to let doubt in. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself I owed her. That word owed settled between us like furniture that never quite fit but couldn't be moved. My bedroom was the only place that still felt like mine, with pale blue walls chosen when I was 14, a desk by the window with a chipped corner, a closet door that stuck unless you lifted it just right, and the faint scent of old books and lavender sachets Miriam insisted on replacing every spring. That room held every version of me: the child who cried into her pillow after my mother's funeral, the teenager who whispered dreams into the dark, the young woman who believed gratitude could protect her, until that folded paper crossed the table. After I finished reading, Miriam stood and returned to the sink, washing the same clean mug again. She said she wasn't trying to be unkind, that she had done her part. I folded the paper slowly, my fingers shaking despite my effort to stay calm, and in that moment something painful and simple settled in my chest. I had grown up in a house where love was real, but never unconditional, and I was about to learn exactly how much my childhood was worth, down to the dollar. After that paper crossed the table, nothing in the house looked different, and somehow that made everything feel worse. The same beige walls, the same polished counters, the same ticking clock that now seemed to measure not time, but debt. I paid the rent the next month without saying a word. I folded the bills neatly, the way Miriam liked, and placed them on the counter before leaving for work. When I came home that evening, the money was gone, replaced by an envelope with my name written on it and the date carefully noted in the corner. It felt official, final, like a quiet agreement I had never truly consented to. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was adulthood, responsibility, growth. I stopped buying coffee on the way to work. I skipped lunches out with coworkers and pretended I wasn't hungry. I lingered longer in the grocery store aisles, calculating what I could afford to eat without inviting comment. Every dollar I saved felt like proof that I was trying, that I was worthy of staying. Miriam counted the money every month, not discreetly. She sat at the kitchen table, glasses low on her nose, aligning the bills, tapping their edges together until they were perfectly straight. When she finished, she slid them into an envelope and wrote the date, sometimes adding a small note in the corner. "Thank you," she would say, already turning away. Not thank you for helping, not thank you for contributing, just thank you, the way you thank someone who owes you something. Soon the comments followed, about how long I showered, about lights left on in the hallway, about groceries that weren't on sale. Each sentence was calm, reasonable, almost gentle, but together they pressed against me until I felt smaller in my own skin. I began eating dinner later, after she had finished, just to avoid conversation. I learned the rhythm of her footsteps well enough to know when to stay in my room. I kept my door closed more often, even though she disliked it. Once she paused outside and asked lightly, "What are you hiding?" I laughed and said nothing, but inside I knew the answer. I was hiding my discomfort, my resentment, the slow realization that I no longer felt like family. Sundays used to be quiet, comforting days. Now they made me uneasy. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, sunlight spilling across the carpet, Miriam sat in her armchair with her notebook balanced on her knee. She cleared her throat. "I've been thinking," she said, and my stomach tightened because that phrase never meant anything good. She told me I was working full-time now and that the room I stayed in was quite large. When I asked what she meant, she calmly said that she could rent that room for more if I weren't family. I reminded her that I was family. She adjusted her glasses and replied, "Which is why I've been generous." The word generous echoed in my head long after she'd moved on, heavy and sharp. I started noticing things I had once ignored: how she mentioned my expenses when talking to relatives on the phone, how she framed every sacrifice as ongoing, never complete. Once I overheard her say, "Young people don't appreciate what they're given," and I realized she was talking about me. Another time, while looking for a pen, I found an envelope in her filing drawer with my name written on it. Inside were rent receipts, utility splits, careful notes in the margins. She knew exactly how much space I occupied, not just in the house, but in her life. The realization made my chest ache with a mix of shame and anger I didn't yet know how to name. The next increase came without warning, a new note on the counter. Adjusted rent, effective immediately. I stood there listening to the refrigerator hum, my reflection faint in the dark window, and something finally settled inside me. This wasn't about teaching me responsibility, it was about control. As long as I lived under her roof, she decided my worth, my limits, my cost. No matter how much I paid, it would never be enough because what she wanted wasn't money, it was proof that I still belonged to her. The discovery came on a Saturday morning when Miriam was at church. The house felt unusually quiet, almost peaceful. I was looking for a stapler in her desk drawer when I found the folder, thick, heavy, labeled carefully in her handwriting. Household contributions, personal. My name written beneath it. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were records going back years, clothes she bought me in high school, school supplies, doctor visits, groceries from the months after my mother died. In the margins were notes that stole the breath from my lungs. Didn't say thank you, wasted food, unappreciative tone. She had been keeping score since I was a child. I sat there for a long time, the smell of old paper and polish filling the room, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't budgeting, this was a ledger of love and debt. I put everything back exactly as I found it and went to my room, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't cry right away. I just stared at the walls, wondering how many moments I thought were safe had already been priced. That evening, when she mentioned rent again, something in me finally broke open. I told her I seen the folder. She didn't deny it. She told me I shouldn't have gone through her things, that I didn't understand what she had given up. When I asked if I was supposed to pay for being raised, she looked at me as if the answer were obvious. Yes, she said. In that moment, the truth landed fully. We weren't aunt and niece anymore. We were creditor and debtor. And no matter how hard I tried, I would always owe her something she believed I could never repay. That night, lying in bed, listening to the house settle around me, I realized something else just as painful. Staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. I didn't know how yet, but I knew then that I couldn't keep paying for my childhood with my adulthood. The next few days were a strange combination of fear and clarity. I went about my routine, made my meals, answered work emails, all the while feeling the weight of Miriam's quiet expectations pressing down on me. Every step I took through the house felt measured, careful, as if I were navigating a space that no longer belonged entirely to me. I caught myself flinching when I heard her footsteps in the hallway, a reaction I hadn't had since I was a small child waiting for approval, and it made my stomach twist in a way I could no longer ignore. I began keeping a closer eye on her routines, not because I wanted to spy, but because I needed to understand the rules of this house that had suddenly become foreign. She had habits that now felt like traps, her precise placement of envelopes on the counter, the way she aligned the bills by color and denomination, the timing of her comments about expenses that always came right after I returned from work. Everything was part of a system designed to remind me that I was not just living in her house, I was living under her judgment. One evening, I decided to confront her directly. I stood in the kitchen while she washed the same dishes she had already washed twice that day, trying to find words that didn't make me sound like a child or a rebel. "Miriam," I began slowly, my voice unsteady, "this isn't normal. You've kept a ledger of my life since I was 11. Clothes, groceries, doctor visits, everything. Why?" She paused, the sponge suspended in midair, and looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I needed to," she said quietly. "You don't understand what I sacrificed." I shook my head. I'm your niece, not a tenant. Love shouldn't have a receipt." She looked away, turning back to the sink, her hands moving mechanically as if to avoid answering. "Someone has to be responsible," she said softly, not angry, just firm. "I did my part, and now it's time you do yours." The words were simple, but they cut deeper than any yell, any accusation could have. That was the betrayal. Not the rent, not even the meticulous notes, but the realization that her love had always been conditional, that every hug, every smile, every act of care had been weighted, measured, and stored for later use. After that night, I started planning. Not revenge, not out of spite, but escape. I needed to reclaim my life, to regain control over the space and the memories that had been monetized without my consent. I began looking at apartments online, saving every penny I could, figuring out how to move quietly and efficiently. I made a list of the things I would take, things I couldn't leave behind because they were mine or because they held pieces of my history Miriam couldn't claim. The first step was small. I stopped contributing extra to the grocery budget, telling myself it was fair since I was now paying rent. She noticed immediately, her sharp eyes flicking over the empty space where the envelope of cash should have been. "I see you're budgeting differently," she said with a controlled smile, but I could feel the tension in the air, the first ripple of resistance. It was subtle, but it was enough to give me the courage to keep going. Then came the day I told her I had found a place. I tried to stay calm, measured, but my hands trembled as I held the lease agreement. "I'm moving out," I said simply. She stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Moving out?" she repeated, her voice steady but thin, fragile around the edges. I nodded. "Yes, I need to live my own life in a space that's mine." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, but I didn't step back. I couldn't. She was quiet for a long time, then finally said, "You're sure you understand what that means?" I did. I understood more clearly than ever. It meant freedom. It meant reclaiming every memory, every room, every childhood moment without the price tag attached. Packing was both liberating and heartbreaking. I carefully wrapped the books I had read under her roof, the blankets she had folded with me at night, even the small trinkets I had collected over the years. Each item was a reminder of love that existed, yes, but love that was conditional. Every box I carried down the stairs, every bag I loaded into my car was a step toward reclaiming my life, reclaiming dignity, reclaiming my own version of family. A family defined not by debt, but by care. By the time I walked out the door for the last time, Miriam was standing in the hallway, not saying a word. The air between us was heavy with unspoken history. I looked back at the house, at the room I had lived in for 12 years, and felt a mixture of grief, relief, and determination. That room, those walls, those memories, they were mine. They had been monetized, manipulated, and controlled, but I was taking them back, piece by piece. I had learned the lesson painfully. Love without respect is not love at all. When I finally moved into my own apartment, the sense of relief was immediate but strange. The walls were bare, the air smelled faintly of new paint and promise, and there was no ledger waiting for me, no tally of every misstep or forgotten thank you. I unpacked slowly, placing each item just so, giving myself the small luxury of control I hadn't realized I'd been missing. For the first time in years, I could hear the sound of my own breathing without feeling it measured, judged, or weighed against some unseen standard. It wasn't long before Miriam noticed I wasn't returning her calls as often. She texted carefully at first, polite inquiries about my new address, my work, my health. But then the messages became sharper, edged with expectation. "Don't forget your responsibilities," she wrote one afternoon. "Family isn't free." At first, I felt the old twinge of guilt, the pull of obligation drilled into me over years, but I reminded myself that I had already paid attention, paid bills, paid for every moment she ever kept score of. Now I owed nothing. The day my cousin came by to check on me marked a turning point. She had always been close to Miriam, almost like an extension of her aunt's influence. "Are you sure about this?" she asked cautiously, as if I might be making a mistake. I nodded firmly, holding up a stack of unpacked books. "I'm sure," I said. "It's my life. I'm done being rented out to family." Word spread slowly through relatives, not maliciously, but inevitably. I could feel Miriam's reputation waver slightly. Whispers began at family gatherings. People were surprised, then curious, then quietly reflective. Had they known? Had they always been counting too? Miriam faced the consequences not with anger, but with restraint. She wasn't shunned, but a subtle change in the way relatives spoke to her made it clear her behavior had been noticed and judged. Invitations became less frequent, offers of help were tinged with hesitancy. I never gloated, never whispered judgments. Instead, I allowed the truth to ripple naturally. The ledger of love she had kept for years had been revealed through my departure, through the quiet assertion of boundaries, and it was enough to create moral reckoning without cruelty. Even neighbors noticed the change. Casual remarks at the grocery store, friendly questions at church, gentle curiosity from people who had once only seen her as a generous aunt, they all shifted in subtle ways. Miriam maintained her composure, of course, the same tight-lipped pride she had always worn, but now that pride carried a faint shadow of reflection. I didn't need to say anything. My life had become a living statement of autonomy, and that alone carried weight. In my own space, free from scrutiny and endless calculations, I started to rebuild. I could make mistakes without someone logging them, cook meals that might be wasted, stay up late reading without anyone measuring the cost. The financial freedom was small but significant, the emotional freedom even more so. I began writing again, something I hadn't done in years because I always felt monitored, always felt obligated to justify my time. The blank pages were mine, unbilled, untouched by expectation. And yet, I carried with me a mixture of grief and understanding. Miriam had raised me, yes, and her intentions were not cruel in the obvious sense. She had given me safety, food, education, and protection. But in doing so, she had transformed love into an economy, a system of credit and debit that left no room for human error or natural affection. I forgave her, not to excuse her behavior, but to free myself from the lingering chains of obligation. Forgiveness, I realized, was less about her and more about reclaiming my own peace. Life moved forward. I made new friends, created routines I could control, and allowed myself to live without accounting for every word, every step. And in quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons learned. Love cannot be measured, and care that comes with a price is not unconditional. True family is defined not by payment or expectation, but by respect, trust, and freedom. Months passed, and with each one, the weight of the past lifted a little more. My apartment became more than just a space. It became a sanctuary, a place where the walls didn't judge me and the air didn't carry the echo of expectations I couldn't meet. I painted one wall a soft lavender, unpacked the books I had grown up with, and hung the photographs that reminded me of who I was before money and control crept into love. Every morning I brewed my own coffee, listening to the soft hum of the city outside, and felt the strange comfort of independence. I began to rebuild relationships cautiously. Old friends from school who had drifted away over the years came back into my life, drawn not by gossip, but by the authenticity that now radiated from me. Work became a source of pride, not a way to contribute to someone else's control. Even my connection to Miriam changed. I reached out sparingly, not out of fear, but out of choice, establishing boundaries that I had never dared set before. When I spoke to her now, the conversations were polite, limited, and controlled, not tense, but honest. I no longer measured every word, every gesture for approval. I had learned the value of my own autonomy. Therapy helped too. I unpacked years of subtle manipulation, guilt, and self-blame in sessions that taught me to recognize love that came with conditions versus love that was genuine. I cried a lot, sometimes with relief, sometimes with rage, but always with the growing understanding that I deserved freedom, that my past was not a ledger to be paid, and that emotional exploitation could be overcome without bitterness. I also began mentoring younger relatives and friends, sharing pieces of my story in gentle, reflective ways. I didn't want them to learn the same lessons through pain. I taught them that loyalty does not mean enduring exploitation, and that true family does not charge rent for affection. It was empowering to use my experience as guidance for others, to turn what had once been a source of shame into a tool for emotional resilience. And slowly, life filled with light again. I cooked meals I enjoyed without judgment, decorated my space with things that made me happy, and finally allowed myself to rest without guilt. The lingering fear of being indebted emotionally, financially, or morally faded with time. I learned to recognize genuine care, to differentiate between kindness and control, and to value myself above the expectations of others. My childhood bedroom in Miriam's house was no longer a memory of debt, but a chapter of growth. I realized the lesson was both simple and profound. Love, when unconditional, is freeing. Love that comes with a ledger, a set of rules, or a price tag is not love at all. It is control disguised as care. I had survived, and more than that, I had reclaimed my life on my own terms. The past did not define me, it had refined me. Would you have had the courage to leave a home that was familiar but no longer safe? Would you have set boundaries with someone who raised you but kept a scorecard of your life? Tell me in the comments. Life is full of lessons we learn the hard way, and sometimes the most difficult lesson is realizing that love should never have a price. If you felt this story resonate with your own life or know someone who needs to hear it, subscribe and share for more real-life emotional stories. Remember, your experiences, your voice, and your boundaries matter, and healing is possible even after betrayal.